The restaurant held 60 people that night, and every single one of them was watching my father raise his glass. 65 years old, silver-haired, wearing the kind of smile that made people in this town trust him with their savings and their secrets. He had reserved the entire back room of Hargrove's white tablecloths, candlelight, the good wine. My mother had been gone for 4 years, and standing at his right side, squeezing his arm like she was afraid he might float away, was my stepmother, Diane. Her diamond earrings caught the light every time she moved her head, which was often because she wanted everyone to see them. I was at the far end of the table, between my aunt and an empty chair, where my brother's wife had excused herself to the restroom 20 minutes ago. My brother, Garrett, was seated directly beside my father. He had been positioned there all evening, close enough that every photographer my stepmother hired would catch them together in the same frame. My father cleared his throat. The room quieted. He said that tonight wasn't just about celebrating another year. He said it was about legacy, about making sure the things he had built didn't scatter when he was gone. He looked at Derek when he said it. He always looked at Derek. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He announced, in front of every business partner, every family friend, every person who had ever shaken his hand in this county, that he was transferring his 38% stake in Callaway Manufacturing to my brother, effective immediately. A gift. A vote of confidence. A passing of the torch. The room erupted. Applause. Gasps. Someone near the front actually stood up. Derek pressed his hand to his chest like he was overwhelmed. His business partner, a man named Garrett, who had been sitting at the adjacent table with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, pumped his fist once, slow and satisfied, like a man watching a wire transfer clear. I didn't applaud. I didn't move. I sat with my wine glass halfway to my lips and watched my father glow under the attention of people who had no idea what they were actually celebrating. 60 people in a room. And not one of them knew what I knew. Not one of them understood that the 38% stake my father just handed my brother with so much ceremony and love didn't belong to my father anymore. It hadn't for 18 months. Before I tell you exactly what happened when I stood up and said so, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know how far this one travels. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and I am a mergers and acquisitions attorney. Not the kind who drafts boilerplate contracts for small businesses. The kind the SEC calls when a company's ownership structure needs to be unwound fast and cleanly, often because someone powerful is about to be indicted. I have spent 6 years learning exactly how assets move, how they hide, and how to make them impossible to steal. My father built Callaway Manufacturing over 30 years. Metal components, aerospace supply chain, government contracts. Solid, unglamorous, worth about $40 million on a good day. He started it with my mother's inheritance and his own obsession with precision engineering. When she got sick, he kept building. When she died, he kept building. The company was how he processed grief. It was also how he avoided his children. Derek and I were raised differently. Not subtly differently. Comprehensively differently. He got the car at 16. I got a job at the grocery store. He got his college paid for without discussion. I was told the money was tied up and that I should look into loans, which I did, and which I paid off over 7 years on my own. He got invited to every meeting my father held at the house, every dinner where deals were discussed. I was invited to Thanksgiving. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because you need to understand that I was not surprised. The announcement my father made tonight was not a shock to my system. It was a confirmation. The only thing that surprised me was how public he chose to make it, how cheerfully he handed a fraudulent gift to 60 witnesses. Because here is what my father did not know. 18 months ago, at his own request, I restructured his estate. He had come to me quietly, worried about inheritance taxes, worried about a lawsuit from a former contractor, worried about the kind of thing that happens to wealthy men when they get older and their signatures become valuable. He asked me, his daughter, the attorney, to help him protect what he had built. He trusted me with the architecture of everything he owned. I set up a Delaware holding company called Meridian Asset Trust. I moved his 38% stake in Callaway Manufacturing into it. I handled the documentation, the filings, the signatures. I was thorough, because I am always thorough, and because I understood who my father was, and who Diane was, and who Derek had been slowly becoming since Garrett came into his life 2 years ago. I made myself the sole managing member of that trust, not because I planned to steal anything, because my father asked me to protect him, and I did. What my father signed tonight, in front of 60 people and 2 event photographers, was a transfer of shares that no longer existed in his name. He had gifted my brother something he hadn't owned since the previous spring. I put my wine glass down. Diane found me by the coat check, 10 minutes after the applause died down. She had separated from my father smoothly, the way she always moved through rooms, frictionless and purposeful. She touched my elbow with 2 fingers, the way you touch a surface you're not sure is clean. She said my expression was making people uncomfortable. She said I should go back to the table and congratulate my brother. I told her I had some questions about the document my father just signed. Her smile didn't waver. That was one thing about Diane. She had very good smile control. She told me that the document was straightforward, that my father had made his decision, that this was what he wanted, and that if I had concerns, I could discuss them with the family attorney in the morning. I asked her which family attorney, because the last time I checked, I was the family attorney. She leaned closer. Her perfume was the expensive kind, layered and persistent. She told me, quietly, that my father had retained outside counsel for this particular transaction, that he had felt it would be a conflict of interest for me to be involved, that certain decisions needed to be made without me in the room. I understood then. She hadn't just planned this dinner. She had planned around me. She had found a way to execute a transaction involving my father's estate without my knowledge, using an attorney I hadn't vetted, for a transfer that was legally void because she didn't know about Meridian Asset Trust. She thought she had outmaneuvered me. She thought removing me from the process was the same as removing my power. She didn't understand that you cannot outmaneuver someone who designed the maze. How did you end up here? I asked her. Not at this dinner. In general. How did a woman with your particular skill set end up married to a manufacturing executive in a mid-sized city instead of running something? She blinked. It was the first crack. She hadn't expected a question. She had expected pleading, or tears, or a quiet retreat to the parking lot. I'll give you the short version, she said, the warmth leaving her voice entirely. Your father is generous. Your brother has potential. You have always had more than enough, and you have always acted like it wasn't enough. Tonight is not about you. I nodded. You're right, I said. Tonight isn't about me. She exhaled. Her shoulders came down a half-inch. She thought she had made her point. I went back to the table. Garrett was the one I watched the rest of the evening. My brother I knew. Derek was greedy but not sophisticated. He didn't invent schemes. He walked into rooms where schemes had already been built and made himself comfortable in them. Garrett was the architect. Garrett was the reason Derek needed access to my father's stake in the company. And Garrett was the reason I had spent 3 weeks in October reviewing SEC filings related to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. His legal name was Marcus Garrett Holloway. He had been introduced to my brother at a conference 18 months ago, right around the time I was setting up Meridian. He was 44, divorced twice, dressed like money, spoke like money, but the actual money was complicated. His import consulting firm had revenues that didn't match its overhead. His previous business partner had settled a civil fraud claim 2 years ago for an undisclosed amount, and 6 weeks ago, while reviewing filings for a different client entirely, I had seen his name on a list of persons of interest in an SEC investigation into securities fraud through inflated government contract valuations. I hadn't said anything. Not to my father, not to Derek. I had opened a secure channel to the SEC attorney I worked with regularly and sent a very short message. I told her I had a family situation developing that she might find professionally interesting. I asked her to keep my name out of it for the time being. She had responded the next morning. She thanked me. She told me the investigation was ongoing. She told me the target had recently been attempting to acquire a stake in a government-adjacent manufacturing firm in order to redirect contract awards. Callaway Manufacturing held 3 active Department of Defense supply contracts. Derek wasn't just getting shares. Garrett was getting access. I looked at Garrett across the table. He was talking. Animated. His hand moving in the air the way men do when they're telling a story they've polished. My brother laughed at whatever the punchline was. The document was sitting in front of Derek now. Signed. Folded back into its envelope. Garrett's hand rested on the tablecloth 2 inches from it. Not touching. Just near. I picked up my phone under the table. I sent 1 message. 7 words. He signed it. I think tonight is the night. The reply came in under a minute. We're outside. Give us 10 minutes. I ordered dessert. I was going to finish my creme brulee. My father found me near the end of the evening, when the dinner was winding down and the photographers had packed up. He put his arm around my shoulder the way he did when he was in a generous mood. Expansive and warm and slightly unaware of the specific geography of other people's feelings. He told me he hoped I understood. He said he knew it might seem unfair, but that Derek needed this more. That Derek had struggled. That I had always landed on my feet and I would continue to land on my feet because that was simply who I was. He said it like a compliment. Like my ability to survive his neglect was a personality trait I had been born with, unconnected to any choices he had made. I asked him when he had moved his shares into Meridian Asset Trust. He looked at me blankly. He said he didn't know what that was. I told him it was the Delaware holding company he had signed the paperwork for in March of last year. The one that now held his 38% stake in Callaway. The one he had asked me to set up to protect his estate. He stared at me. I watched the memory surface slowly. The way things surface for people who sign documents without reading them because they trust the person handing them the pen. He said he didn't realize that was still in place. I told him it was. It was very much in place. It was, in fact, the reason the transfer he had just announced was legally void. He had signed a document transferring ownership of shares that hadn't been in his name for 18 months. The outside counsel Diane had hired without telling him who the family attorney was, without telling him to check the current ownership structure, had conducted no title search, had filed nothing with the state, had produced a document that was ceremonially convincing and legally worthless. My father's face changed. It went through 3 or 4 expressions in quick succession, none of them comfortable. Before he could respond, I heard Derek's voice rise behind us. He was standing at the table, the envelope in his hand, talking to Garrett. His voice had climbed in a way that meant something had shifted. Garrett had his phone out, and whatever he was looking at had made the smooth confidence drain from his posture. The SEC attorney I had contacted was not known for her patience, apparently. I walked back to the table. Garrett was already standing, his jacket on, talking quietly and quickly into his phone. Derek was watching him with the look of a man who is only now understanding that the boat he got on was not going where he thought. I put my phone on the table, face up. 2 men I didn't recognize had entered through the side door by the coat check. They were wearing the specific kind of unremarkable clothing that people who don't want to be identified as federal agents wear at restaurants. One of them made eye contact with me. I gave a small nod. "Derek," I said, "you should sit down." He looked at me, then at the 2 men, then at Garrett, who was no longer in the room. They had someone on the side exit. "What is happening?" Derek said. It wasn't really a question. It was the sound of a man feeling the ground move under him. I told him, clearly, in front of my father and my aunt and the 3 remaining couples at the end of the table who had not yet put on their coats. I told him that the shares he had just accepted were held in an irrevocable trust that my father had established in my management. That the transfer document he had signed had no legal effect because there was no asset to transfer. That Garrett, the man he had been going into business with for the past 18 months, was the subject of an active SEC investigation into securities fraud. That the entire purpose of acquiring a stake in Callaway Manufacturing was to gain influence over the company's government contracts in order to inflate their reported value in financial disclosures. That by accepting those shares tonight, even if they had been valid, Derek would have handed Garrett a path directly into 3 DoD contracts. The room had gone very quiet. My father sat down in the nearest chair. He looked diminished in a way I had never seen him look before. Not old, exactly. Exposed. Diane appeared at his side. She had heard enough to understand. Her face had the tightness of someone doing rapid internal calculations. She turned to me. Her voice was composed, but just barely. She said I had no right to hold assets that belonged to my father's estate. She said the trust could be dissolved. She said she would have her attorney file an action. I told her she was welcome to try. I told her that the trust was irrevocable, which meant it could not be dissolved by my father, by me, or by anyone, without a court order demonstrating specific legal grounds. I told her that the outside counsel she had hired had missed an 18-month-old filing because they hadn't looked for it. I told her that her signature appeared on 2 of the documents she had asked my father to sign tonight, which meant she had participated in an attempt to transfer an asset she had conducted no proper due diligence on, which, depending on what she knew about Garrett's situation, could constitute a few different things. She opened her mouth. I told her I hadn't finished. The 2 men from the side door had moved closer. One of them had shown his credentials to my brother, who was sitting down now, his elbows on his knees, staring at the tablecloth. Garrett Holloway was taken into custody at the parking valet stand, which I knew because the SEC attorney texted me while I was standing there. She included a brief description of his expression when he realized the valet had been replaced. My father looked up at me from his chair. His face was doing something I didn't have a word for. It wasn't shame, exactly. It was closer to the moment when a person realizes they have been seeing someone for years without actually looking at them. He said my name. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the grocery store job at 16. I thought about the loans. I thought about every dinner where decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited into. I thought about how many times I had built something quietly, alone, without applause, while he was in another room handing torches to someone else. I told him I had protected his company. I told him the trust was still in his interest. I told him when he was ready to have a real conversation about the estate, he knew how to reach me. Then I turned and walked toward the coat check. Diane caught my arm at the door. Not the polite 2-finger touch from earlier. A grip. Her voice had lost its composure entirely. She told me I had ruined everything. She told me that all she had ever done was try to hold the family together. She told me I was punishing my father for loving someone after my mother. I looked at her hand on my arm. I told her that what she had tried to do tonight was move my father's assets to her stepson, bypassing the legal structure of his estate, using an outside attorney who had no knowledge of the existing ownership arrangement, in coordination with a man currently under federal investigation. I told her that was not holding a family together. I told her to let go of my arm. She did. The valet brought my car around in 4 minutes. The night air was cold enough to see my breath. I stood on the curb and listened to the sounds of the parking lot, a car somewhere, voices, the distant thrum of the city, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter. The specific relief of a person who prepared for every version of a thing and then watched the thing happen exactly as prepared for. I drove to my office. Not because I had work to do, because the office was where I thought clearly, where the files were organized and the hours were mine, and no one had ever tried to give my desk to someone else while I was standing in the room. I poured a cup of coffee from the machine on the credenza. I sat down at my desk. The city was small and dark outside the window, and somewhere in it, Derek was probably calling every person he trusted, and Diane was probably calling her attorney, and Garrett was probably calling no one because the phone was gone. My father called me at 11:17. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 11:41. I let that one go too. He left a message the second time. His voice was quiet, stripped of the after-dinner warmth, stripped of the performance. He said he thought he had been protecting the company by cutting me out of the decision. He said Diane had told him I was too emotionally involved. He said he had believed her. He said he understood now that he had been making decisions about a structure he didn't understand, based on advice from a person with a conflict of interest, and that he should have known better. He said he was sorry. I played it twice. Not because I was moved. Exactly. Because I wanted to hear it clearly. I wanted to hear what an apology sounded like from someone who had been handing my things to other people for 31 years. It sounded like a starting point. A small one. I didn't call him back that night. I finished my coffee. I reorganized the files on my desk that didn't need reorganizing. I sat in the quiet office and let the silence be mine. Which it was. Which it had always been. Even when I'd had to build the entire room around myself before anyone would admit I was in it. The SEC investigation produced 3 indictments over the following 4 months. Garrett was the primary target. 2 of his associates were named in a secondary count. The charges included securities fraud, false statements in federal contract filings, and conspiracy. My name did not appear in any public document. That was by design. Derek was not charged. He had signed a void document in pursuit of an asset that didn't exist in the form offered, which was bad judgment but not a crime. He called me twice in the weeks after the dinner. Both calls were short. He didn't apologize. He said he hadn't known about Garrett. I told him I believed him. That part, at least, I did. Diane retained an attorney who filed a brief challenging the trust structure. It was dismissed in 6 weeks. The trust was exactly what I had said it was. Irrevocable. Properly filed. Legally sound. Her attorney withdrew from the case, and she did not retain another one. My father had lunch with me in January. He chose the place, a diner near his office that he had been going to for 20 years, and he ordered the same thing he always ordered, and he talked about the company for most of it, which was how he talked about everything that mattered to him. He asked me to remain as the managing member of Meridian. He asked me to look over the estate documents that Diane had drafted and tell him what I found. I found 4 things that would have cost him significantly. I fixed them. He thanked me in the specific way he thanked people, direct and brief, like the words were a resource he had learned to conserve. I told him it was my job. He said he knew. He said he meant it anyway. I drove home after that lunch with the windows down even though it was cold. The radio was on and I wasn't listening to it. I was thinking about the document I had filed 18 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in my office. Alone, with no fanfare, with no one watching. The document that had made everything else possible. The thing I had built in a quiet room that no one had thought to look inside. That was the version of the story I didn't tell at the dinner. The part where the preparation started not as revenge, not as a trap, but simply as a woman doing her job thoroughly, because thorough was the only way she knew how to do anything. The trap was a consequence of the preparation, not the other way around. The difference matters, because plans made out of anger have holes in them. Plans made out of precision tend not to. I learned that the same way I learn most things. The hard way, in a room I built myself, without being invited.